Hello everyone and welcome back to Writing Today. In this episode, I'll be giving you 15 tips on getting better with descriptive writing. As always, you can read this blog post on my website, thepensedsleuth.com. There's a link to that in the description below. And if you're going to check out the links in the description, you should also check out the free course I have available. It's a course about creating a more immersive fantasy world, talking about the different elements that will make your world a lot more interesting to your reader. If you are interested in that free course, be sure to claim it. And as always, I do hope you enjoy the video. With that said, let's talk about descriptive writing. Now there are some points I do want to make about descriptive writing style before we get into the very first tip. First, let me talk about a misconception people seem to have about descriptive writing style. A lot of writers, beginner writers specifically, believe that descriptive writing style is all about adding a lot of unnecessary information. But really, descriptive writing style is the challenge not to do so. When you're writing descriptively, you are providing information with a bit more detail and depth, but that doesn't mean that you're adding something unnecessary. That is the difference that many writers will need to understand, and I do have tips on that later on. The second thought I do want to talk about is that the descriptive writing style does in fact slow down the pacing of your novel, and there are many tips regarding that which I will be talking about. But this is a known fact about descriptive writing style. When you're describing something a bit more in depth, you are taking your time, you're slowing things down, so it will affect the pacing depending on where you are being descriptive. Right, with those points now discussed, let's get straight into the tips on improving your descriptive writing. The very first tip is to use more dynamic words. One of the major problems descriptive writing has is that it can bore the reader. Sometimes the description just isn't interesting enough to get the reader's attention. This can lead to skimming through until they get to a more exciting parts. The key is in that action. The reader is looking for an interesting word in the story. It can be something related to the plot, or it can just be related to a dynamic word that gets their attention. These dynamic words are what will keep your descriptive writing interesting. Use more dynamic words whenever you feel a descriptive passage is getting a little too slow or boring. This will help make it a lot more exciting to the reader, so they won't skim through it until they get to a more interesting part. This means understanding what is important in your scene, or what words will capture the reader most. Tip number 2 is to talk about the senses. If you want to be descriptive, but aren't sure what to talk about in a scene to paint a better picture, then look at the senses. You are trying to immerse the reader, and you need to do that with more than just descriptions of the visual elements in the story. You also want to talk about the experiences of the other senses. For example, if you're going to describe a grisly scene that the detective in your story comes across, yes, talk about the visuals and how much they disgust the detective. But also add atmosphere and impact of the shocking sight. You need to do that by talking about the smells, the texture, and the sounds in the vicinity. By addressing the senses in your descriptive writing, you will immerse the reader a lot better than if you were just to talk about the visuals. Tip number 3 is to use character emotions. Another element in the story to consider is the emotions. Depending on the scene, a character can go through a range of emotions that emphasize the atmosphere of the scene. You can have a darker scene bring up a past trauma, or a light scene evoke a positive memory. A character can convey these emotions through their expressions and their actions. But if you do write your character's thoughts, you can also address that. A character might have a short inner monologue talking about their emotions, or just a simple statement that captures the scene well. One can argue that the senses also convey emotion, but that is only to a certain degree. By directly addressing the specific emotions of each character, which will be different depending on their past and personality, you'll get a more well-rounded view on the emotions of the characters in that scene, rather than just addressing the senses. This variety of emotions will make the scene a lot more realistic and impactful. Tip number 4 is to avoid crutch words. Every writer has crutch words to cling to despite all the efforts to do away with them. Crutch words are words such as like, well, literally, obviously, and so on. When it comes to me, I extend this list with redundant phrases like personally, quite, and when it comes to me. Crutch words tend to appear more in descriptive writing. This is because there is more opportunity for them to appear. The reason these crutch words appear so often in writing is because they give us an opportunity to breathe, to think about what to say next. So when we are using these crutch words in our writing, what we are doing is giving ourselves some time to think about what happens next. So this tip is all about understanding what your crutch words are, spotting them when you are writing, and being able to tell whether they should stay or when they should go. Tip number 5 is to challenge your imagination. Being descriptive means being more creative with how you describe something. There is an inherent need to avoid repetition when describing subjects, which is why when 2 or more subjects share a similar trait, a writer needs to focus on a different trait or describe that subject differently. There is also another desire to keep the descriptions investing, which means avoiding descriptions that sound too simple or too boring. A story with creative descriptions that will maintain the interest of the reader will always win out over simple descriptions. But if you can't get a creative description or you feel it's not necessary, then don't feel bad about using some more simple descriptions to carry on the scene. This is always much better than creating a more lengthy description that will take away from your scene rather than add to it. Tip number 6 is to use backstories. There is more to being descriptive than lengthy sentences that define a subject matter. Descriptive writing means also including additional elements to add to the story or the characters. It means a more in-depth, well-fleshed out story, not just describing the way the character looks for pages, something that you definitely don't want to do. And a great way to add depth to a story is to address the history behind a character or place. By creating these events or these memories, you'll make the place or character a lot more interesting in the eyes of the reader. It will also emphasize the character's personality and help the reader to understand their goals in the novel a lot better. Tip number 7 is to take note of the scene and pacing. Another big mistake descriptive writers make is that they think they should be descriptive when describing everything. However, that will only cause problems when it comes to the impact of the scene. For example, the best fight scenes are made simple and gritty for a reason. It adds to the realism and the impact of the scene, but most importantly, it fits the pacing of such a scene. A descriptive fight will come off as boring and a lot less impactful. There's simply too much space in between the start and the end, or too much space between each action. So as I said at the start of this video, descriptive writing slows the pacing down. So when you have a more exciting scene, you're going to have to become more simplistic with your writing style in order to fit the pacing of that scene. So it's not just about the way in which you're descriptive, but it's also when you are descriptive. Tip number 8 is to avoid fluff by being interesting. It's a simple tip but an important one. Fluff is what bores the reader. Fluff is off-topic conversation. It is used as a way to bump up the word count in a novel. You'll usually find fluff in books that are barely the length of a novel because the idea or the writer wasn't good enough to easily reach the word goal. The less common type of fluff appears in lengthy novels, not for the sake of the word count, but because the writer tends to go off topic. So I understand already a lot of writers understand what fluff is, but I also want you to pay close attention to your writing and how you feel about it. Are there some scenes or segments that simply just don't sit right? They seem boring or unimportant. So if it feels this way to you, it will feel the same way to the reader, perhaps even more so. In which case, it's better to cut it out completely. Tip number 9 is don't list your physical characteristics. Listing characteristics is a great way to make the reader quickly forget some facts about your character and the way they look. A writer should never list every physical characteristic when they introduce a character. Instead, a writer should describe a characteristic when it's relevant. Most writers with a simple writing style won't even mention these characteristics unless they are important to the scene. But as a descriptive writer, you have a lot more poetic freedom with how you describe things, which means you can have more physical characteristics than a simple writing style. For a simplistic writer, it's not so easy because then they'll have to mention that characteristic 2 or 3 times before it will stick in the reader's mind. But a descriptive writer can deliver a description that's a bit more in-depth pertaining to that characteristic, making that characteristic a lot more memorable. Just not when you bombard the reader with all of these descriptions. Tip number 10, if it's not interesting, then is it funny? If not, cut it out. We have talked about cutting out unnecessary information, but also need to talk about the descriptive writing that is simply written in the novel to be interesting or funny. I am aware of an amusing style in writing where the writer gets carried away with providing information, either to talk about something interesting, as in an aspect of the story, or simply to include comedy into that scene. However, these kind of lengthy descriptions tend to serve a purpose in these novels. The writer does these kinds of descriptions often. It is part of their style, so it is actually necessary to the story, and for that reason should be kept. But if you are not consistent in doing this, or if the fact is not interesting, or if it is not funny, then it's something that needs to be cut out. Tip number 11 is to make sure every description matches the tone. The words you use and the way you use them need to fit the feeling you are trying to create. I have practiced with my students the art of describing something negatively and positively, and it comes down to the way you use your words, not just the words themselves. For example, using positive words and descriptions for a positive scene is great, but a writer should also take note of the length of the sentence and its structure. In a positive scene, a longer sentence can help create a more relaxed feeling, while shorter sentences create a more exciting feeling. Another example is when you have a big reveal, be it an evil monster or some exciting news. By drawing out your sentences, you'll create more suspense. This is a structure that works well in more thriller-esque novels. But when the sentences are shorter, there's a lot more excitement and energy in that scene, making it a lot more intense rather than suspenseful. Tip number 12 is to make it easy to read, don't overcomplicate it. Another trap descriptive writers fall into is the desire to write lengthy, complicated sentences. We can all understand the need to be poetic with descriptions. It gives us the opportunity to test our skills with metaphors and to use more emotionally driven words to convey a feeling. Yet in doing so, we tread closer to the line we should never cross, a line that decides if the reader needs to only read your sentence once or twice. We all want our readers to follow our story without confusion. We don't want the reader to stumble along through our words and have to read sentences over and over until they understand what is going on. So we need to structure our scenes logically and cleanly. And the best way to do that is to avoid two of the worst traps descriptive writers fall into. And that is sentences that are way too long and words that are unnecessarily lengthy as well, or uncommon. The reason that we avoid these two is because it will make our sentences a lot easier to read, while still being descriptive. This is a very important thing to maintain, and one of the skills that every descriptive writer needs to develop is to understand when they are overcomplicating a scene. Tip number 13 is to compare your writing to your favorite descriptive author. When aiming to be a descriptive writer and not having a writer to compare yourself to, you will struggle to measure any progress you make. It should be easy enough to find the author of the book that truly immersed you. When you have that author in mind, Look through the novel and try to understand how their descriptive writing worked. Take note of segments to compare your writing to if you feel that your segment of writing just doesn't work. By having these segments of writing to compare yours to, you can better understand what is working and what is not working in your novel. In doing so, you will improve your own writing style and your confidence in writing, rather than trying to copy someone else's writing style. Tip number 14 is to get a harsh but fair second opinion. I've always advised a second opinion regarding one's writing. Usually, I recommend a second opinion as another person can tell you if a character feels bland, if the plot is uninteresting, or if a segment lacks logic. These are important things to know when doing a rewrite, or at least before you start editing. However, when it comes to writing style, I recommend getting a harsh second opinion. The writing style is a lot more specific and requires either a professional writer or an avid reader to spot the problems in your descriptive writing. And when you receive that advice, be sure to take it with a pinch of salt. Any advice that someone else will give you will help you figure out the flaws in your writing, but there are some aspects of your writing that are simply a part of your style and you cannot change, because then you wouldn't be comfortable with writing that way. So, take the advice which you feel will help improve your style, but you can either compromise or disregard any other advice which doesn't sit so well with you. After all, this is all about improving your own descriptive writing style and not changing your way of writing to fit someone else's preference. Tip number 15 is to simply take your time. I am mentioning this tip because I know there are writers out there like myself, writers whose minds work faster than their fingers, who can write a page in a moment, a chapter in a morning. Yet descriptive writing works against that pace of writing. A talented and experienced writer can pull it off, but if you are new to this style, or to writing in general, you will speed through your descriptions to follow the plot. You are naturally better with simple writing styles, but that doesn't mean you can't write descriptively. All that means is taking a breath and taking the time to slowly work your way through a scene. It's easy for writers like us to just go with our instincts and write fast, to move through a scene so you can start the next one. However, descriptive writing requires you to take the time to create a more fleshed out description. And since this is unnatural for writers like us, it becomes incredibly difficult. And when one does write this way, you still have those bursts or moments between your scenes where your writing style returns to a simplistic fashion, or to a more disorganized version of descriptive writing. So, for the writers like me, I recommend simply taking your time and moving as slow as possible. If you are stuck with a difficult moment in a scene, then yes, you can move on. But when you have the opportunity to be descriptive, you should be descriptive. If you don't, your writing style will appear inconsistent, and this will be very difficult to edit in the editing process, and will most likely lead to you rewriting the whole novel. Now, my final thoughts on the descriptive writing style is that it was very difficult for me, at least, to get into it. As I mentioned in the previous tip, I am not a descriptive writer. I like to move the story along, I like to keep the story simple to read, and that's just a style that works for me and I'm happy to write that way. However, there are times when I do want to be more descriptive. I want to create those more in-depth fantasy worlds that I read in novels when I was younger. But I simply don't have that instinctual way of writing, so it becomes a bit more uncomfortable for me to write that way. So if there's any one tip that I would pick out of these 15 and recommend the most, it would be to get a harsh second opinion. Whenever I feel a scene needs to be a lot more descriptive, but I lack the instincts to pull it off, I then ask my wife for her opinion on the scene. She's a reader of more descriptive novels and helps me to be a bit more descriptive with my writing as well. She'll tell me if a description falls flat or if there is room for description somewhere in the story. So while I can judge others on their style, whether they be descriptive or simple writing styles, I cannot judge my own, as this is an entirely different feeling or perspective when you look at your own writing. And writers generally do struggle to review their own writing. which makes sense. It's a personal thing. However, if you can get a person to give you a second perspective, it will do your writing a world of good. And with that, this video has come to an end. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to check out this blog post, you can find it on my website, thepentsleuth.com. There is also a free course available, as I said before. Link to that in the description below. Thank you for watching, and as always, good day, good night, and happy writing.